Daniel often wondered how a life could feel so full on paper yet so hollow in practice. At 28, he had a stable job as a graphic designer in London, a modest flat in Camden, and, most importantly, a partner who loved him, or at least claimed to. Michael, 31, was dependable in every sense. He taught English literature at a secondary school, brought home fresh bread from the bakery on Sundays, and never forgot to water the plants. To friends, they looked like the picture of quiet domestic happiness. But to Daniel, the edges of that picture had begun to fray. Their mornings told the story best. Michael rose early, preparing lesson plans over a steaming mug of coffee, while Daniel remained half asleep on the sofa, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone. Conversations between them had narrowed to practicalities: who would pick up groceries, which bills needed paying, what time Michael's parents expected them for dinner next week. The intimacy they once shared, laughter over wine, late-night kisses that turned into tangled sheets, had dulled into gestures of routine. Daniel couldn't remember the last time Michael had reached for him without distraction in his eyes. It wasn't that Michael was unkind. He was thoughtful in quiet ways, leaving a folded note in Daniel's jacket pocket, reminding him to wear a scarf when the weather turned sharp. But those gestures felt mechanical, like duties performed rather than passions offered. Daniel tried to convince himself that love matured into comfort, that fiery beginnings always cooled into steady warmth. Yet some nights, staring at the ceiling while Michael breathed steadily beside him, he felt like a ghost trapped in his own life. The loneliness unsettled him most when he compared it to how alive he had once felt. He remembered the early years, Michael reading poetry aloud in a smoky bar, his eyes lit with mischief, the way their hands had found each other effortlessly in crowded streets. That spark had been real, intoxicating. Now it was memory, not presence. Daniel longed for someone to look at him as though he mattered entirely, if only for a moment. When Michael cancelled their dinner plans for the third time that month, claiming a mountain of essays to grade, Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, pressed a polite kiss to his partner's cheek, and retreated to the bedroom. Inside, anger simmered under his calm exterior. He knew teaching consumed Michael, but he couldn't help resenting the constant sacrifices. He wondered when he had stopped being a priority, when the relationship had turned into an obligation. That Friday evening, unable to bear another night of silence and television alone, Daniel found himself reaching for his coat. He told Michael he was stepping out for fresh air, avoiding eye contact to prevent questions. Michael barely glanced up from his papers, simply murmuring, "Don't stay out too late." The word struck Daniel with a strange weight, as though his absence barely registered. He left before the bitterness showed on his face. The city air carried a damp chill, and Daniel walked aimlessly through the streets, letting the lights of Camden blur around him. He passed bustling pubs and groups of friends laughing loudly, feeling like a spectator to other people's joy. Part of him wanted to return home, to bury the loneliness under a blanket and a glass of wine. Yet another part, the restless part, urged him forward. He hadn't gone out alone in months, hadn't allowed himself to exist outside the boundaries of Michael and Daniel. Tonight, he thought, he would reclaim a fragment of independence, even if it meant only a solitary drink. His feet carried him toward a small bar tucked between a record shop and a late-night cafe. Its windows glowed with warm amber light, and faint music drifted out when he pulled the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was low-lit and intimate, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Daniel slid onto a stool near the counter, ordered a whiskey, and let the burn steady his nerves. He told himself there was nothing reckless about this, just a man escaping the monotony of his own apartment. Yet as he scanned the room, his gaze caught on someone seated at a table across the bar. A stranger, alone, with eyes fixed directly on him. Daniel felt the jolt immediately, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't the casual glance of curiosity, it was deliberate, charged, almost inviting. For a moment, Daniel forgot the drink in his hand, forgot even the damp chill still clinging to his coat. He only knew that, for the first time in a long while, someone was looking at him as though he were more than invisible, and he couldn't look away. The stranger's gaze lingered with unnerving steadiness, and Daniel felt a pulse of heat travel through him. He hadn't been looked at like that in years, not with such unspoken intent. not with such unguarded interest. The man across the room was in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair swept back in a way that suggested casual confidence. Even from a distance, Daniel noticed how composed he seemed, one hand resting lightly on a glass, the other drumming faintly against the table as though to a private rhythm. When Daniel finally looked away, his pulse refused to settle. He took a quick sip of whiskey, hoping the burn would anchor him, but when he glanced up again, the man was already standing. The crowd parted slightly as he walked over, deliberate steps echoing with quiet assurance. "Mind if I sit?" the stranger asked, his voice low, warm, and threaded with an accent Daniel couldn't place immediately. Daniel gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Go ahead." The man slid onto the seat, offering a smile that revealed both charm and mischief. "I'm Ethan," he said simply. "Daniel." His name felt strange on his tongue, as though he were introducing a version of himself he hadn't met before. They exchanged the usual pleasantries: work, city life, the rain that had persisted all week, but there was nothing usual about how the words carried. Ethan listened with an attentiveness Michael hadn't shown in months. His eyes didn't dart to his phone or over Daniel's shoulder, they stayed fixed, unwavering, as though each sentence mattered. That alone made Daniel feel lighter, more alive. Their conversation soon loosened. They compared favorite travel destinations, laughed about awkward first jobs, and swapped small confessions, the kind people usually kept to themselves. With every shared smile, Daniel felt his guard erode. He told himself it was harmless, just two strangers enjoying a drink. Yet his body betrayed him, leaning closer than necessary, fingers brushing against Ethan's when their glasses shifted on the bar seemed to shrink around them. The music softened, the other patrons blurred into background noise. Ethan's laughter was rich, his gestures precise, and every accidental touch sparked something Daniel thought he had lost: desire. When Ethan rested his hand briefly on Daniel's, the contact was electric. Daniel froze, caught between guilt and craving. His mind flashed with Michael's face at home, bent over stacks of essays, trusting without suspicion. But the warmth of Ethan's touch drowned the image before it could solidify. "Want to get some air?" Ethan asked, tilting his head toward the door. The suggestion was casual, yet Daniel felt its weight immediately. For a beat, Daniel hesitated. The sensible answer hovered at the edge of his lips: "No, I should go home." But the loneliness he had carried for months whispered otherwise. He nodded, sliding from his stool. Outside, the night air was sharp, carrying the hum of traffic and distant shouts of revelers. They walked without a destination, their shoulders brushing occasionally, every touch deliberate though unspoken. Ethan's presence filled the silence comfortably, and Daniel found himself smiling without reason. They stopped beneath a street lamp, its glow casting Ethan's face into sharper relief. There was a pause, heavy and charged, as if the city itself waited for their decision. "You don't have to," Ethan murmured, though his eyes said otherwise. Daniel's heart thundered. He thought of Michael, of their shared apartment, of the life built brick by brick. Then he thought of how invisible he had felt for so long, how desperately he craved being wanted. And in that instant, the scales tipped. "Where?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Ethan's answering smile was steady, almost knowing. Without another word, he gestured toward a hotel just across the street, its sign glowing faintly against the dark sky. They entered in silence, their footsteps muffled on the polished lobby floor. At the desk, Ethan handled everything with practiced ease, while Daniel stood beside him, heart pounding, mind spinning with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. When the door to the room finally closed behind them, the choice was no longer abstract. Ethan reached for him with unhesitating certainty, and Daniel, surrendering to the pull, let himself be taken. The world outside, the routines, the obligations, the quiet grief of his relationship, faded until nothing remained but heat, breath, and the dangerous promise of being seen again. Daniel woke to the faint hum of traffic outside the hotel window. The sheets tangled around his body still carried Ethan's warmth, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to sink into the memory of the night, the rush, the closeness, the feeling of being entirely desired. Then his phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message glowed on the screen: "Michael, are you home yet?" Daniel's stomach twisted. He silenced the device, sat up, and pressed his palms against his face. The room smelled of sweat and whiskey, a sensory reminder of what he had done. Ethan stirred beside him, murmuring something half asleep, but Daniel was already pulling on his clothes. He couldn't bear to stay another minute, not when guilt had begun to drown out everything else. The walk back to Camden was punishing. Each step seemed to echo with betrayal. He rehearsed excuses he would never say aloud, tried to imagine returning to the quiet familiarity of his flat without showing cracks in his expression. By the time he turned the key in the door, dawn had started to lighten the sky. Inside, the apartment was still. Michael had fallen asleep on the sofa, papers scattered across his lap, glasses sliding down his nose. The sight pierced Daniel with unexpected tenderness. Here was the man who had built a life with him, who trusted him enough not to question his late-night absence. Carefully, Daniel adjusted the blanket over Michael's shoulder and retreated to the bedroom, where the weight of what he had done settled like a stone. Morning arrived with cruel normalcy. Michael brewed coffee, asked Daniel how his evening had been, and slid a buttered toast across the table. Daniel's throat tightened as he forced a casual smile. Just had a drink, nothing exciting. The lie fell too easily, slipping into the rhythm of their morning routine, yet Daniel could not shake the guilt. Every gesture from Michael, a gentle hand brushing his, a reminder to take an umbrella, cut deeper now. Where once he had felt neglected, he now saw only Michael's quiet devotion. It wasn't grand or fiery, but it was steady, and Daniel realized how fragile that steadiness had become with one reckless choice. The memory of Ethan lingered regardless. In quiet moments, Daniel replayed flashes of the night, laughter across the bar, the spark in Ethan's eyes, the press of lips that demanded nothing but surrender. It haunted him not because he wanted to return, but because it revealed a hunger he could no longer deny existed inside him. Days passed, and Daniel found himself overcompensating. He cooked dinners unprompted, initiated conversations, tried to fold warmth back into their routine. Michael noticed the change but didn't question it, accepting the gestures with mild surprise and gratitude. For Daniel, every act of kindness carried a double edge, both an offering of love and an attempt to cover the fissure beneath. At night, lying beside Michael, Daniel stared at the ceiling once more. Only now the silence was louder. He knew he had fractured something sacred, even if no one else could see the break. Ethan's name never left his lips, but the memory of him had carved a permanent scar. One evening, as they walked home from the market, Michael slipped his hand into Daniel's. The gesture was ordinary, almost absent-minded, yet Daniel felt his chest tighten. He realized that from the outside, nothing had changed, two men in love, building a life together. But inside, a secret pulsed like a hidden fault line that he thought about confessing, about spilling everything in one painful rush. But the words caught in his throat. He feared not only the loss of Michael but also the collapse of the life they had built. And so he stayed silent, burying truth beneath practiced smiles and tender gestures. Still, silence has its own weight. Daniel carried it everywhere, at work, in bed, in every small glance Michael gave him. And though he remained present in their home, a part of him lingered in that hotel room, forever tied to the night he had chosen desire over devotion. I stayed, Daniel thought as Michael squeezed his hand, but I stayed carrying a secret. And secrets echo louder than words. The days that followed blurred into a careful routine, but Daniel could not shake the feeling that every moment carried hidden weight. He still laughed at Michael's dry jokes, still helped fold laundry, still joined him at Sunday dinners with Michael's parents. Yet beneath the surface, each action felt rehearsed, as if he were playing a role in a play where one wrong line could shatter the set that he thought the guilt might dull with time, but instead, it sharpened. The silence between them, once merely dull, now pulsed with accusation. Every time Michael smiled without suspicion, Daniel felt both relief and dread. Relief that his secret remained buried, dread that he was building a life on a fault line that could erupt without warning. One evening, Daniel found himself staring at Michael as he read on the sofa, glasses perched lightly on his nose, a lamp casting a soft halo around him. Michael looked peaceful, almost boyish in his concentration. Daniel felt his throat close, the thought rising unbidden, I don't deserve him. The weight of that truth made him set down his drink, his hand trembling slightly. Later that night, he dreamt of Ethan. Not of the act itself, but of the way Ethan had looked at him across the bar, like he mattered, like he was still capable of sparking desire. When he woke, the image lingered, and Daniel wondered which haunted him more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that part of him longed for that validation again. At work, he struggled to focus. Deadlines slipped by, and colleagues noticed his distracted air. His sketches lacked their usual boldness, his presentation stumbled. When his manager asked if everything was all right, Daniel forced a smile and claimed he was just tired. It was the same lie he told Michael, the same mask he wore for everyone who couldn't see the fracture beneath. One night, while clearing away dinner plates, Michael asked casually, "Are you happy?" The question landed with such force that Daniel nearly dropped the dishes. He managed a laugh, shaky and forced. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" But Michael's eyes lingered on him, searching, as though he sensed a shift he couldn't name. Daniel retreated to the balcony afterward, the night air cool against his skin. He realized then that secrecy had a way of isolating, of fencing him off from the very person he lived with. Michael's presence was steady, but Daniel felt increasingly apart, as though the secret had built a wall invisible to anyone else. That he began to notice cracks in Michael too. The long hours, the exhaustion etched into his features, the way his laughter came less easily these days. Perhaps they had both been drifting long before Ethan entered the picture. Perhaps the betrayal was not the cause but the symptom of something neither had confronted, yet the thought offered no comfort. It only made the silence heavier. One weekend, they attended a friend's birthday party. Surrounded by chatter and clinking glasses, Daniel watched Michael interact with old university friends, animated and relaxed in a way Daniel hadn't seen in months. He realized with a pang that Michael was still capable of lightness, still capable of connection. The problem wasn't Michael alone, it was the distance Daniel had allowed to grow between them. Walking home, Michael slipped his arm through Daniel's, a gesture so familiar it nearly broke him. Daniel forced a smile, but inside, he was unraveling. He wanted to confess, to lay the truth bare and see whether their relationship could withstand the weight. But fear held him back. Fear of destroying what little remained, fear of becoming the villain in a story they had once built together. That night, lying awake again, Daniel understood something he hadn't before. The secret wasn't going away. It had embedded itself in their life, shaping his choices, coloring his thoughts, shadowing every tender moment. And unless he faced it, through confession, or change, or some reckoning yet unknown, it would consume not only his love for Michael but also the version of himself he still wanted to be. The echo of that night with Ethan no longer lived only in memory, it lived in every silence, every hesitation, every breath beside the man he loved.